I'm Paul Perillo, and welcome to the Philly Factor, a new show looking at the people, places, and things that make up the greater Philadelphia area. Philadelphia is one of the most historic areas in our country, and it's home to the most historic square mile in the United States, that being Old City. But Philadelphia is also known for, of course, the Revolutionary War, the fight for freedom, but it's also known for its revolutionary concept in the treatment of criminals, aimed at not simply punishing the criminal, but move the criminal toward spiritual reflection and change. Much of that occurred at Eastern State Penitentiary. And our guest is from Eastern State Penitentiary, no longer a prison, but a very popular tourist attraction. Sean Kelly is the program director for Eastern State Penitentiary. And Sean, thanks for spending some time with us here on our debut program, The Philly Factor.
Really honored to be here for your first show. Thanks for inviting me.
I think you would agree that Philadelphia is known for many things, but there is really this hidden treasure, if you will, in the Fairmount section of Philadelphia known as Eastern State Penitentiary, which was a prison. It was a prison that gave criminals and inmates sort of the finer things in life, if you will. I mean, the prison opened, it's my understanding, at a time when Andrew Jackson was in the White House, and the White House didn't have running water, but here the inmates at Eastern State were sort of treated to the finer things in life.
Sure. Well, if you visit Eastern State Penitentiary, you get a real flavor for what life was like for these early inmates. And you find that they had built an entire world around the idea of solitary confinement. They wanted every prisoner to live in total isolation. And that required things like running water. So even at a time when the wealthiest Americans didn't have indoor plumbing or toilets, the inmates at Eastern State, they had flush toilets, running water, they had a water spigot in their cell, they had heat. So you're thinking, like everyone thinks, well, that sounds pretty nice.
Sure.
Or, who wouldn't want to do that? Want to go out and commit a crime and go to the Eastern State Penitentiary? And they also ate better than most people, most working class people would have eaten, on the outside. But you have to balance that against the treatment they got when they arrived in the building, which was total solitary confinement. Typical sentence was about 2 years in pure isolation. So imagine nothing to read, aside from a copy of the Bible, but nothing else to read, no letters from home, no newspapers, no books, no visitors. Nothing to do aside from sit in your cell, do some kind of simple work, and ideally they hoped you'd be thinking about your crime. So you'd be spending your time looking into your heart, and they hoped you would become penitent. Eastern State is the world's first true penitentiary, a building designed to make someone penitent. So the creature comforts must have been fairly nice, although I would point out that those flush toilets only flushed once a day.
Only once a day.
They flushed the entire system out at once.
Right.
School kids love hearing about this. But the downside of the treatment there was a pretty significant downside, was almost total, complete removal from human contact.
It was my understanding in doing research for the show that if they were to transport the prisoner, the inmate, out into like a common area or even out into the courtyard of the prison, that they put a black hood over their head, so this way they didn't have make eye contact with anybody else or see where they were going or
That's exactly right.
where they were going from.
When they first arrived in the prison, they covered their head with a hood. The hood had no eye holes, and they would take them back to their cells and remove the hood. And that process would make sure the prisoner never saw another inmate, could never identify another inmate after they were freed, wouldn't know where the door was. Eastern State has a half-a-mile wall that surrounds it and has one door. And theoretically, the prisoner would have no idea where that door was. So they'd spend 23 hours a day inside of their cell. They got a full hour a day of outside exercise time, but it was in their own personal yard. Every cell had a little yard attached to the back. So even when they were getting outside, they were still in almost total isolation.
The prison opened in 1829?
That's right.
Okay. And it was pretty much an active prison from 1829 right on through 1971?
That's right. So 142 years of active use. It's mind-blowing. And it's the single hardest thing to talk about in the building's history, because visitors walk in and we tell them all about this solitary confinement system and its influence on other prisons and this idea of penitence, and inmates are living in pure isolation, and they turn the corner and they see the baseball diamond. And you say, well, they didn't do that forever. That idea failed, and they eventually had to find a way to try to get better results, because that isolation system was a total failure. Actually, we don't know what the effect was on the inmates, because they had so much trouble tracking it, but they couldn't prove that it was working, and it was very expensive.
So through the entire 140-year plus history, they sort of, I guess, debated whether it was working, whether it wasn't working. They sort of, if they felt that it wasn't working, they went in and fine-tuned so much of the solitary confinement that was, you know, part and parcel of Eastern State at the beginning wasn't there at the in the waning days back in 1970, 71?
They totally abandoned it. So that solitary confinement system was called the Pennsylvania system. It was world famous. It was duplicated all over the globe. There are about 300 copies of Eastern State Penitentiary all over the world. Charles Dickens traveled to Philadelphia specifically to see it and to write about it. It had this enormous effect in the early 1800s. And then by the late 1800s, it was sort of a typical prison. There were a lot of other prisons like it. Most of them copied from it, but there are a lot of other prisons like it. And then officially in 1913, they gave that isolation system up. They just dropped it. In fact, we know now that they had sort of eroded it over the years, but officially in 1913, they dropped it. And from 1913 until the prison closed, 1971, it was a typical prison with you know, the chess games and the cell block corridors and the haircuts and the, you know, they had a jazz band and fist fights and the big mess halls and all that stuff you see in the movies was happening at Eastern State. Most of the prisoners and most of the staff didn't even realize the significance of the building they were then living in. It had this enormous effect, but it had been over 100 years since anyone had given it any real thought, and it became just a typical prison.
Now, Charles Dickens visited the prison. He could have been, you know, one of the first tourists to visit Eastern State Penitentiary. And where I'm going with this is that it has become a very popular tourist attraction today in Philadelphia.
It's funny, you know, it was a popular tourist attraction, and it's become one again. When it first opened, the scale of the building, people had just never seen a building this big before. Its footprint is 11 acres. In the 1820s, people didn't build buildings that were 11 acres. It cost $780,000 when it opened. And just the scale and the expense of the building was amazing. And you could take a tour. So people would come up and they would tour the building as tourists in the 1830s, 1840s. So when Dickens was there was probably many other tourists in the building with him again. Of course, later when it became a typical prison, that all fell off and it closed. It was abandoned for 30 years. And then starting in 1994, we've reopened it as an unusual historic site. It's unlike any place you'll ever see. And it's really growing quickly in its popularity. We get about 100,000 visitors a year coming through to learn about the building's history.
We're talking with Sean Kelly, who's the program director for Eastern State Penitentiary. Now, Eastern State Penitentiary is located in the Fairmount section of Philadelphia at 22nd and Fairmount. And if you ever drive in the area of 22nd and Fairmount, you know you've seen Eastern State Penitentiary from outside the walls, if you will. You know you're there. Give us an idea that when the prison was built, what the rest of the geography of the area was like, because literally right across the street from the intersection of 22nd and Fairmount, you have old brownstone homes that you know, people are living in today. And while they may, you know, realize the importance of having a tourism industry in their neighborhood, those homes, were they there when it first opened back in the late 1800s?
They were not.
They were not.
They were not. Eastern State was built on farmland outside the city of Philadelphia. Okay. And it was designed on the outside to look like a castle. They hoped that would deter crime. And so the city of Philadelphia only extended about as far as 10th Street back when Eastern State opened in 1829. So even though they had surveyed the rest of the city, they knew where it was going to go, there was mostly nothing out there. And so up in the neighborhood where Eastern is now was mostly farmland. The prison was built on an old cherry orchard. And so there were a few other institutions around up there, but for the most part it was just open farmland. And the houses went in the 1840s, 1850s. As that neighborhood developed. But as you say, that's what makes it, just makes the prison so out of scale with the rest of the neighborhood. I'll never forget the first time I saw it. I was riding a bicycle up 16th Street looking for the prison. I was going to go up there for a tour when it very first opened for weekend tours. And I turned my bicycle onto Fairmount Avenue, and I had been told I couldn't miss it. So I turned my bike onto Fairmount Avenue, and I look around and I thought, what is that thing? And I thought, I guess that's the prison, because you just don't expect to see a medieval castle that's 680 feet long. It's 2 blocks long in the middle of a residential neighborhood. It's just completely out of scale with the whole neighborhood.
And we should mention here that the reason why it's still there is because of efforts on this part of the city of Philadelphia to preserve the property, if you will, because when, I guess, the state of Pennsylvania abandoned the prison, they sort of turned the property over to the city. Is that what happened?
That's right. The state stopped using it in 1970. and they'd been trying to get all their prisoners out of it since the 1930s. It was never designed for a congregate-style prison. In other words, a prison where the inmates could mingle. And it was dangerous, and it was not the way the prison was built. So the state finally got their last inmates out in 1970, and there was a terrible incident in Philadelphia prisons in 1971 where a warden and a deputy warden were killed in a Philadelphia prison. And so Philadelphia used Eastern State for a couple of months in 1971 just to get some of their inmates out of the Philadelphia system. So that was the last time the prison was actually used. Philadelphia then began looking at this prison saying, well, this could be useful again. Maybe we should buy it from the state, which they did. They bought it in 1980 for about $400,000. And their intention was at first to start using it again as a prison. They discovered quickly that it's way too far gone. It'd be cheaper to build a new building. So that was plan B. Tear out the inside, leave the wall, tear out the inside and make a new detention center or some kind of a correctional facility. And then they began looking at the cost to demolish a prison that has walls that are 18 inches thick every 10 feet for 11 acres. And it's like moving a stone quarry.
Sure.
And so they couldn't afford to do that. They began looking, at that point they sort of washed their hands of it and said they were going to sell it to a real estate development corporation. And there were plans for things like a shopping mall and condominiums. The condominiums were going to leave the outside wall, so this would be like your ultimate gated community,
sure.
right? The 30-foot retaining wall, right? And to his credit, our current mayor, John Street, working with the then mayor, Wilson Good, eventually looked at Eastern State Penitentiary and said, this building has more potential. It changed the way that Americans think about prisons, and it deserves better than being turned into a shopping mall. And threw it back into the preservation community and said, well, if you want this building so much, then you figure out what to do with it. And we opened it as a museum in 1994.
So for the past 12, 14 years then, we have this tourist attraction up there in the Fairmount section of the city. When the historic preservationists say, all right, we want to keep this, we want to keep the integrity of the building, we want to turn it into a tourist attraction, but we want to maintain, I guess, the history of what Eastern State was all about, and perhaps, you know, what went on here, some of the notorious inmates who may have graced the walls of Eastern State. I mean, is there a fine line then, Sean, that you have to walk in terms of making a tourist attraction, not deviating from telling the story, but yet attract people to come see your attraction? Because quite honestly, people may be fascinated with what Eastern State looks like, but may not. They may be fascinated with what some of the cells might look like, but beyond that, how do you still draw people to 22nd and Fairmount? You got to have a story, you got to have a thread, something to attract them to your destination. Absolutely,
and it's something that we talk about a lot. You know, where do you draw the line between sensationalizing the history or talking just about its human interest, and where do you draw, how do you tell that story in a way that is appealing to a lot of people? For instance, visitors love hearing about the escapes from the building. There are about 110 maybe escapes from the building, including a very famous 1945 tunnel escape. With a bunch of inmates, including Willie Sutton, tunneled out. And that is just a wonderful story. I mean, it's a story that you just almost, a screenwriter couldn't do better for a story. And people love hearing about Al Capone, who was in the building in 1929, 1930. And so it has these natural draws. And so, we always coach our tour guides that that people are fascinated by that stuff, and we need to tell that story and tell it well and make it interesting. We hope visitors will also find it interesting to learn the lessons that solitary confinement can be damaging to the human psyche, which is really the great lesson of the building, that they tried this experiment with solitary confinement, hoping that it would improve the character of the prisoners, but it didn't work. Today, solitary confinement is generally used as punishment. And so we hope that people get a balance of both when they come. There's some amazing things to reflect on while you're there. There's some, very subtly we work in some issues of race, the way that the building was segregated during certain periods. But we try not to take too heavy a hand. We know that a lot of people want to come up there and they want to hear about Pep the dog, who was a Labrador retriever who was in the building in 1924 as an actual official prisoner. And this is great stuff, and so we want to make sure to tell those stories well and make sure that people can really access the entire breadth of Eastern State's history.
Now, the whole story of Pep the dog sounds like something that they'll turn into a Disney movie at some point down the road, you know?
It's going to happen someday, I'm sure.
Sean actually has brought along some photos that we're going to look at here, and he'll give us an idea of what we're looking at. These are all photos from Eastern State Penitentiary. Again, is located at 22nd and Fairmount, in the Fairmount section of Philadelphia. And again, it is a tourist attraction. It's a tourist destination. And who's this mug shot that we're looking at here?
That's Slick Willie. That is Willie Sutton. That's one of his photographs from Eastern State Penitentiary. I believe that's his intake photograph. We have another one of him the day that he escaped and was recaptured. Similar shot, only he's covered in mud. They literally dragged him back in, and whenever the inmates came in and went from the building, they photographed him.
And here's another famous mug shot that we have.
Oh yeah, that's Scarface. That's Al Capone.
Al Capone.
It's a little known fact that Al Capone was, the first time he ever spent any time in prison was in Philadelphia. He was traveling from Atlantic City back to his home in Chicago and was arrested in Philadelphia for carrying a concealed deadly weapon. And he did 8 months in Philadelphia, 10 months in Philadelphia prisons, 2 months at Holmesburg, which is now also closed,
right,
and 8 months at Eastern State Penitentiary. And his cell is a very popular stop.
I was going to say, because from what I've read is that, Al Capone was, sort of lived sort of like a king at Eastern State. I mean, he had rugs and carpeting and wall, hangings and stuff. So he was sort of living in the lap of luxury, it would seem, at Eastern State.
He was living about as comfortably as you can live inside of a prison cell, which isn't all that comfortable. But I mean, he had, we know he had oriental rugs, he had antique fine furniture, he had oil paintings on the wall. My favorite detail, he had a cabinet-style radio. And when a certain journalist came to visit him, he was listening to waltzes in his big armchair. So you think that, I think, wow, he's listening to a radio in his armchair, it's got to be pretty comfortable. The flip side of that is that his toilet was still in view of the hallway. He still had to visit his children with a sheet of glass between him and his kids. He probably would have found it humiliating. So a prison cell is still a prison cell. I mean, you could take the nicest hotel room in the world and lock the door and say you're going to be in there for 8 months. You're going to miss every wedding and your kid's birthday, and it's still a prison cell.
Sure.
But the other inmates were not happy about this, by the way. You can imagine.
Has Capone's cell, I mean, I guess through looking at, and here's I guess a photo of one of the hallways of Eastern State.
That's sort of a typical cell, what looks like today.
Okay.
After being abandoned for 30 years.
But in documentation from Eastern State, you're able to find out the exact cell that Capone was in.
Oh, sure.
And you were able to go back and sort of recreate what the cell looked like?
We have. We have taken his cell. We know the exact cell number, the cell block number, and the cell number. And it's easy because they called it Park Avenue. There are these 2 cells, there used to be 4 when Capone was here, that are on the wrong side of the gate that separates the guards from the inmates. And they always saved these cells for their pet inmates who, when you open the gate, were out milling around with the guards, not milling around with other inmates in the cell block. So they gave him this favorite cell, and there are newspaper descriptions of the kind of furniture that he had. And so we don't know if the rug was red or blue. We don't know if the armchair was leather or upholstered, but we know there was an armchair. We know there was a desk. We know there was a cabinet-style radio. We know there were oil paintings on the wall. So we hired someone who knew a lot about the 1920s tastes, and she did her best guess at the kind of furniture that someone like Capone would have had. And it's close enough to get you a feel. We're pretty sure that it must have a similar feel if it's not exactly.
Now, the photo that we just saw of the cell, you can see that the paint has actually chipped away from the wall. It's fallen off. So we're actually seeing in that photo what the cell looks like today. So has much work gone into sort of restoring some of the not so famous famously inhabited cells? I mean, or when you're taking a tour of Eastern State, you're seeing what it looks like today, but not necessarily what it looked like back in the early 1900s.
That's exactly right. We're taking a pretty strong stand on this, that we want to leave the building looking old. We think that visitors really value it. We think that if we restored every square inch of it, it would look fake. And people walk around, it's a true ruin. I mean, I said that at the start of the show, that it's an unusual historic site. It's unlike anything you're going to see anywhere else, except maybe visiting a castle in Europe, where it's just let fall into ruin and we're just leaving it as much as we can. It's a bit of an illusion, because if you saw the building from above, you would see we've replaced most of the roofs. So there are things we need to do to keep the building from just collapsing in on our visitors and things we need to do to keep our visitors safe. But in general, when we're given the choice between fixing something up and just leaving it the way we found it, we try to leave it the way we found it. It's surprisingly beautiful. It's eerie and it's open and it's bright, and the paint's peeling off the wall and the furniture's lying on its side, and you feel like someone just left. I mean, it really has the sense that people were there not that long ago. And if we clean it up and we scrub down the walls and replaster every square inch, replace all the floors and put in new furniture, it's going to end up feeling like people were never there. And it's really the stories. It's the people who are missing from the building that's the biggest challenge for us to work with our visitors, to try to trigger their imagination so that, you know, as we walk through, we can all think about the actual men and women who lived there, the officers who worked there, the lives that were spent inside that building.
What percentage of Eastern State then is actually the tourist attraction? Because you said it's 2 city square blocks big. Not all of it is open to the public for, I guess, mainly security purposes because of the deteriorating condition of some of the, you know, the physical plant, if you will. So what percentage of the plant then, of the prison, is open for tourist reasons?
I'd say probably about half of it is open. A lot. I mean, a lot, enough so that if you were to go in and try to see everything that we have open and really take your time with it, we have an audio tour where their former officers and former inmates tell you stories about what you're looking at. So the greenhouse or death row or the kitchens have these audio stops. If you were to do all those audio stops, it would take about 3.5 hours.
Really?
So most people don't do them. We give you a map and people pick and choose. And they say, oh, I really want to learn about the architecture. I want to hear some good stories about escapes. I see over here there's stuff about ghosts, and I want to hit that, and I want to make sure to learn about, I want to go see Al Capone's cell. So they figure out what they want to see and they go out there and they learn. And there's a basic 40-minute tour that tells you the building's history. But it's a lot of the building that's open. We were saying before we came on air, you and I were talking about parts of the building that are still not open.
Sure.
And there are some of them, like the old chapel, the synagogue, the movie theater, the kitchens, the hospital. Eastern State was a small city up there. I mean, the officers always talked about the city within the city. And so we're ticking off those things year by year. We opened Death Row a few years ago. We opened one of the new big cell blocks last year. Our next goal is to get the synagogue opened. We hope for 2008. But there's still so much to see that don't wait for the synagogue. Come up and see it now.
Exactly. You say there's so much to see, and there really is so much to do, and this leads us into the next segment of our program, because one of the reasons that people go to Eastern State, especially in the early part of the year, is Terror Behind the Walls, which has become sort of a Halloween attraction, late September through October. People go and visit and really, scared, out of their wits, if you will. But how did that come about? Because, I mean, you talk about the ghost of Eastern State. So there's sort of like, I guess, a built-in, byline or a storyline into the whole thing, with the ghost of Eastern State. So did somebody come up with, why don't we do a Terror Behind the Walls event for, September and October?
Well, the place is just a natural for ghost stories. I mean, if you walk in the building, every visitor who walks in, even if they have no idea that we have a haunted house, they'll walk in, they'll look around, and they'll say, this place is really eerie. It's beautiful, but even in the daylight, with these shafts of sunlight coming down across these stone walls, it's an eerie, eerie building. And so from the very beginning, there was sort of this demand. People wanted to, hear ghost stories. And so there were Halloween tours even before there was a historic site, main history tour, as a way to raise money to open it up as a museum. So Halloween has always been part of the way we've raised money to tell the building story, to preserve the building, to keep it around for another generation. In the early years, they were very informal. We'd take out 1 or 2 ghost groups a night, walk them out of the cell blocks and tell some ghost stories. And those were fun tours. They weren't able to raise all that much money, but we'd raise a couple $1,000s and it would be fine. But today, Halloween represents 60% of our operating budget.
60%.
60%.
Wow.
So it is a huge chunk of what we do. It's a year-round activity. We begin planning it in November, really aggressively working on it in November, because we need to have all of our plans in place by the middle of the winter and budget it out and make sure we can afford everything so we can start building in the spring and get ourselves, first-rate, world-class haunted house every October.
Now, there's 130 employees that actually participate in Terror Behind the Wall. So Sean Kelly's not putting on, a vampire's costume and scaring people by jumping out.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. But one time you did, I guess, right?
Yeah, it scares me to even hear you say that. But yes, it's 130 employees. So we keep promising ourselves we're not going to grow it any bigger. And then we come up to the next year and we say, well, what if we added this? What if we added that? It's considered one of the best in the country. AOL City Search does top 13 haunted houses every year, and we've made the list for years now. This year they ranked us number 5 in the country. So it's large scale. People come from all over the country. I know this sounds incredible, and no one ever believes me when I say this, but people who like haunted houses travel for them. And so people do the same thing for roller coasters. So we get visitors who come from California, from Florida, and huge numbers of visitors from New York City, from DC, from Washington, from Pittsburgh. It really is a national attraction, and it's got to be good.
Yeah, and I guess now Halloween has sort of become its own holiday, if you will. I mean, it's sort of, equal to Christmas, where people start celebrating, 6 to 8 weeks before, and people start decorating their homes in mid-September for one night in October. So that's got to put the pressure on you to make sure that your attraction is state-of-the-art, bigger and better than, in order to compete with, some of the other attractions, not only in our geographic area, but up and down the East Coast.
That's right, because people travel so much. It's true, Halloween is, they say, number 2 only to Christmas in terms of the economic impact of a holiday. It's huge. There's a Halloween convention that we go to every year in Chicago. There's actually quite a few of them, but we usually go to the one in Chicago. And you look around and you realize it's a big industry with the costumes and the candy and the whole thing. And haunted houses are just a small little part of this. But as an industry, and it really is an industry. It's hard to believe, but it really is an industry. It's growing. I mean, people will definitely spend money on Halloween. Adults spend a huge amount of money on Halloween.
Sure.
It's not really a kids' holiday anymore.
No.
I mean,
really
the whole kids aspect is actually, I don't know if it's shrinking, but it's not. As a percentage, it's got to be shrinking because the adult market has just taken off, and people are, full-grown adults go out and dress up like complete idiots.
Well, that's what's fun about it, right?
I love it. It's my favorite holiday.
And the 2 minutes that we have left, you talked about ghosts. Are there ghosts behind the walls at Eastern State?
I've never seen one, but people come in, they do these paranormal investigations. I'll put in a quick plug for our website, which is easternstate.com. If you go on the website, we have a link called Real Ghost Sightings. Go to the Halloween part of the page and then click on Real Ghost Sightings, and you'll see literally dozens of video clips from people who've come in and say they filmed ghosts inside the buildings. They see the floating orbs and the anomalies and the recording devices and all this stuff. So people do believe that Eastern State's haunted. I can't back it up through personal experience, but I certainly think that if there were ghosts anywhere, you would expect to find them at Eastern State. I mean, you just look around the building and you can feel that.
Yeah. Well, it's been a fascinating half hour, and I have to thank you so much for spending some time with us. And again, the website is easternstate.com, and you can find out more information about Terror Behind the Walls, as well as all the other tours and things that are available there for people to come and see and do up at Eastern State Penitentiary. And again, the location is 22nd and Fairmount, in the Fairmount section of the city. And I got to get myself up there one of these days and take a tour.
Please come up.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks, Sean. Sean Kelly, our guest, program director for Eastern State Penitentiary, with us here on our debut edition of the Philly Factor. My thanks to everybody here for making this happen. My thanks to Sean Kelly for being with us here. And please stay tuned for our show the next time around. For the Philly Factor, I'm Paul Perella. We'll see you next time on the Philly Factor. And we're in a two-shot.